Critical thinking has given humans an advantage over all other species. So why is it a skill we still wish we could be better at? In this new series, we're going to dive into 5 essential books that will sharpen your critical thinking like never before. Each video will take you through one of the book's most powerful insights, tools and strategies for seeing the world and your own beliefs in a completely new way. If you're new here, my name's Zach, I'm a hospital doctor from Scotland, and in each video in this series, I'm unpacking one book at a time to build up your critical thinking skills step by step. So make sure to subscribe if you want the whole picture. It will help you to break free from some of your unexamined beliefs and start thinking independently and effectively. Now, the first book is this one, The Art of Logic. Now, the author, Eugenia Cheng, is a British mathematician who specialises in trying to break down mathematical concepts for people that don't know anything about maths. And in this book, she is arguing that if we understood a little bit more about how logic worked, then we would have better discussions. Now, she's got 4 really important lessons to say about logic, and then 2 techniques that we can use to have better discussions. The first thing she has to say is that logic is built on building blocks called axioms. Axioms are like rules, the irreducible rules that create that logical system. So an example would be Euclid's axioms, where he wrote down 5 simple rules on which our whole understanding of geometry is based. This way of looking at discussions gives us a way of understanding why a right-wing person and a left-wing person, or a conservative and a liberal, might not come to agreement on a particular issue. It's not because they disagree on the substance, it might be because they are working from different axioms. Axioms are really analogous to our fundamental beliefs about a topic. Somebody who is conservative might believe in individual responsibility, that the family unit is an indivisible unit for society, and they might be skeptical of new ideologies. Similarly, liberals might be motivated by axioms about morality, that it's morally good to share out resources amongst all of a people and not to use arbitrary factors such as skin color or race to discriminate between people. Eugenia asks us to think a little bit about what our own axioms might be. Now, she gives us some advice about how we can work out what the axioms are in our own beliefs. So she lists a few different things that she agrees with. She agrees with cancer screening, with the idea of social welfare payments, and believing that survivors of sexual assault should always have a presumption of being believed. Then she asks, well, what are the common features between all of those things? She identifies some intermediate principles that she has that is good to help people even if they might not need it at that time, and that it's important to take evidence seriously even if it leads to unwarranted action. This causes her to realize that there's an underlying belief that it's okay to have false positives as long as you're avoiding false negatives. When you break it down like this, it also gives me a way of saying why I don't agree about that cancer screening example. Is because I think that an enormous amount of harm can come from unwarranted screening, especially if it causes more harm than good. And I prefer a utilitarian approach, that there has to be somewhere in the middle between false positives and false negatives that causes the least amount of harm. Second issue is that logic has limits and a complicated relationship with emotion. Now, we often experience this when we have emotions that overwhelm our logic. And Eugenia tells us about some tactics that we can use to engage our emotions in a more productive way. First example that she gives is about motivating herself to exercise. She realizes that she has a strong emotional reaction to the idea of becoming obese, and this is what motivates her to do her exercise even if she doesn't want to. Similarly, if your emotions are getting out of control in a way you don't like, logic can help us manage them. So a great example of this was when American Airlines, who used to have priority groups for boarding that were called priority groups, and they renamed them groups 1 to 4. This made passengers extremely upset. Now, if they had stopped to think logically, Eugenia argues, then they would have realized that there wasn't actually any change to the boarding system. They were going to get on the plane at exactly the same time in exactly the same order. So why have that silly emotional reaction? Her third lesson is that grey areas are really important. Binary extremes between good and evil are like drawing a line on something that's a spectrum. If you can't say exactly where black starts and white ends, there's a lot of grey area in the middle, and lots of things are like this. Sometimes we need to draw arbitrary lines. For example, when is your bedtime going to be? It could be any time between 7 and 9, but eventually you have to just choose one. Eugenia says that her book is a way for you to always be right about anything. It's always possible to be right, as long as you qualify your statement. So an example of this precise language would be the difference between pointing out an opposite and a negation when you're opposing something. So if somebody were to say the EU is fantastic, the opposite would be that the EU is terrible. But the negation would be to say, well, I do not think the EU is fantastic, which is not quite the same as thinking that it's terrible. This is just one way in which we can have more nuanced opinions in our use of language. The final lesson I've taken from her book is that causation is really complicated. People imagine that causation is a line from cause to effect, but actually, it's more like a complicated web of different causes. And I'm trying not to sound too much like Doctor Who.
It's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
She gives the example, again from a plane incident, where a passenger was booted off the plane after so-called refusing to vacate their seat when instructed. She goes through how actually there were a whole host of other things that caused this, like the fact that the plane was overbooked by the company, the fact that nobody took the offer of money to vacate their seat, the fact that the company decided not to offer more money. And when we think about causation in this way, it becomes very difficult to blame specific individuals or specific circumstances for phenomena that are really more complicated than that. Eugenia says, it is tempting to point the finger of blame at one factor or person, especially if that exonerates ourselves. I believe that it is much more productive to understand the connections of the system. Outcomes are always caused by whole systems, but we can still, as individuals, take responsibility for change. So, what does that change look like? Well, she gives us two different techniques that we can use for breaking down our assumptions into something that's much more logical. First are analogies. So analogies are really important for helping us analyze the principles behind what we think. So some people oppose universal healthcare on the basis that those people really aren't taking responsibility for themselves. And why should other people pay? Let's compare this with an analogy. So we don't expect people to, say, build their own roads. That's something which is done as a public service. So what we're really arguing about is healthcare enough of a public service to be considered essential in that way? Or is it something that you do have the ability to take responsibility for? Personally, I think because healthcare is so bound up in people's education, their income, their socioeconomic status, and their life chances, our health is really impacted by the societies we grow up in and the environments we live in, and individual choice is just a small part of that. That's been my experience working as a junior doctor on the front line of the NHS. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Another way analogies help is that they help us break down the factors about a situation that are relevant to the discussion we're having. So for example, racism of black people against white people. Is that analogous to racism from white people against black people? In one way, you can say, yeah, I mean, they're both analogous. They're exactly the same belief. They're exactly the same sort of discrimination. But some people might argue that these things are not analogous because with one, there's an inherent power dynamic. So if you are the dominant culture and you're being racist to a minority, that is different. And if somebody says that they don't believe in those kinds of power dynamics, you could ask them another analogy. So are you saying that it would be the same for a professor who is making a sexual advance on a student, and that that's exactly the same as the student making a sexual advance on the professor? Regardless of what your opinions on any of these hypotheticals are, it shows you how analogies are a really useful way of getting to the truth about what people think. And that's the art of what Eugenia teaches. Her second technique is called equivalence. So equivalence is there to help you pick up unclear thinking. Equivalence is where you act like two separate statements are the same thing. Sometimes it can be useful and sometimes it can be really, really unhelpful. So for example, if you say that you dislike snacking, and somebody overhears that and thinks that you're criticizing all people who snack, they start to get angry at you and say, how could you fat shame people? How could we can all see how some situation like this could escalate in our own lives. What's important in logical discussions around those issues is to point out when there is a false equivalence. Eugenia uses another example, which is the debate around whether toys should be gendered or not. So on the one hand, people might try to turn the idea of letting girls and boys play with the same toys and make that equivalent to the idea of trying to turn girls into boys or boys into girls, pushing opposite gender roles. On the other hand, the idea of letting boys be boys and girls be girls might be equivalent to some people with the idea of enforcing traditional gender roles onto them. When we realize a false equivalence is being made, we can push back on it and start to have a more nuanced conversation about the thing. The main lesson I take from this book is that we need to hold our opinions a little bit more lightly. We shouldn't, like Republicans and Democrats in the US presidential election are doing, try to cast every single discussion as a battle between good and evil, because that's probably not true. What's more likely is that these disagreements are down to different axioms on each side. They're the result of fuzzy logic that is interfering, whether it's false equivalences or bad analogies. These are all things that we can actually get to the point that we could discuss it logically if we would only put the effort in to do so. By now, you've got a powerful understanding of how logic works and how it sometimes fails us. But critical thinking is not just about logic, it's also about evidence. That's what we'll be looking at in the next video, where we'll be discussing Trish Greenhill's book, How to Read a Paper. That's a must-watch if you want to learn how to decode medical studies and understand the impact that scientific research has on our health and lives. When that video is ready, you'll find the link here. In the meantime, here's another video on my channel about critical thinking, which is a great follow-up to the ideas we've covered here. I'll see you in the next video.